Good evening and welcome to the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network Conference for 2020. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook from the University of the Sunshine Coast, and I'm joining you from the lands of the Yagara people in Ipswich in Queensland, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, as well as those of the lands from where you are joining us. I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, Rebecca Jones. Thanks, Rebecca.
So, although extreme weather throws up many challenges to our physical and emotional health and well-being, these events can also create opportunities for changes and adaptations, and that's what I want to talk about today. My current research is exploring the physical and emotional health impacts of extreme weather in arid inland Australia in the late 19th to mid-20th century. The way people adapted to the impacts and how this can contribute to responding to climate change in the present. I'm exploring these issues through the archives of the Australian Inland Mission and Royal Flying Doctor Service and associated records. Personal and professional diaries of nurses, medical records and nursing reports are proving particularly rich sources with this. The geographic area is a big circle that includes far western New South Wales, southwestern Channel Country and northeastern South Australia, the Northern Flinders Ranges kind of area, as well as the Channel Country, South Australia. The research is supported by the State Library of New South Wales C.H. Curry Fellowship, and as well as an earlier research fellowship at the National Library of Australia. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly outline the main elements of adaptation theories, which I think are very relevant to a lot of papers in this conference, or at least a lot of the theme of this conference. Explore a couple of the physical impacts of extreme weather in the early 20th century and elements of adaptation. And finally, I'll very briefly reflect on the relevance of these findings today. So the theoretical underpinning of my work for about the last 9 years or so has been the related concepts of resilience and adaptation. So resilience is much more than a euphemism for stoicism used in common parlance. And the difference between the two, adaptation and resilience, is very simply, and it's much more complicated than this, but very simply, adaptation is the process, resilience is the state. And for those of you who've heard this bit of the talk already, I apologise, but I promise the rest of it's new. So many academics and academic disciplines have developed resilience theories, but I find the most useful insights come from child social psychology, such as Emmy Werner, Lazarus, etc., and sociological studies of recent environmental events, such as Neil Adger, Margaret Alston. So my synthesis of these different disciplinary perspectives has created a useful definition which drives my analysis. So resilience is the way individuals, groups and institutions respond to exceptional stress or challenge in a way that ameliorates or accommodates its negative impacts. And the main elements of adaptation are withstanding and surviving, regaining composure, some semblance of order, then learning from the experience, preparing for the future, and then crucially changing. And that's the kind of feedback loop. So enduring extreme weather can involve luck, but I argue that resilience involves deliberate, conscious strategies and decisions. Resilience isn't innate and exists within social, cultural, economic, political, temporal, corporeal and environmental context. So while being mindful of the dangers of Pollyannaism, I find both resilience and adaptation to be useful terms to understand weather extremes in the past and present, because conceptually they shift us from passivity to activity. So I'll just talk about some of the physical and emotional impacts of extreme weather in the early 20th century in the area that I'm looking at. I'm finding there are many health impacts, both directly and indirectly, mental and physical, associated with extreme weather. So there's eye, skin, gastric diseases, nutritional deficiencies, vector disease, and mental health and emotional wellbeing effects. I'll just talk briefly about two of these. Red, sore, infected eyes were common sights in interwar years in arid communities. Some were so bad the eyelids were gummed up with pus or scarred and deformed. Conjunctivitis, what the nurses diagnosed as ophthalmia at the time, and even trachoma were diagnosed. Trachoma is a contagious bacterial eye infection which can even lead to blindness. It was endemic in 19th century cities. By the 1940s, it was still common in arid Australia, although not really seen in cities anymore in Australia. Nurse Smyra Blanche, who worked for the Flying Doctor Service, found in her survey of far western New South Wales and east and South Australia in the 1940s, 50% of the people she was visiting living on stations had eye disease. And more than half of these had it severely. And these are both Aboriginal and settlers, mostly settlers, she's surveying. Eye problems were particularly prevalent during drought, with dusty, sandy environments. Clean sources of water were scarce during drought, and little money was available for home improvements such as fly wire and piped water to the home, which made washing difficult. Today, scandalously, remote communities in Australia are the only places in the developed world where trachoma remains endemic. I think something like 5% of Indigenous people in remote communities in the Northern Territory have trachoma. And it's for the same reasons as in the 1940s, settlers, poor access to sanitation and hygiene facilities, such as clean water and poor housing. Australian Inland Mission nurses conducted eye-washing education in schools, educated families about hygiene, and most children wore face nets in summer in the 1930s and 40s. Droughts, flooding and heat waves also contributed to waterborne gastric diseases, such as a typhoid epidemic in Inaminka in 1930 that killed a number of people and infected many other people. Sister Grace Francis of Birdsville, who also worked for the Australian Inland Mission, wrote in her diary of the appalling conditions of the Birdsville town waterhole in 1924. She wrote, "The water from the town hole is thick and not good to drink. There's a dead horse, which is not the most pleasant thing at the end of a waterhole." Police attempted to enforce the boiling of drinking water in Birdsville at the time, but it wasn't always successful. A severe gastric complaint of remote areas was called Barcoo fever, also attractively known as Barcoo's Bew. Symptoms included fever, headaches, vomiting, diarrhoea, ulcerous sores, and in the worst case, seizure and respiratory failure. Barcoo fever was mostly seen during hot, dry weather amongst non-Indigenous settlers. Medical historians have recently suggested that Barcoo fever was probably poisoning by blue-green algae, which develops in warm, stagnant, contaminated waters. Interestingly, Barcoo fever was rare amongst Aboriginal people that the AIM, Australian Inland Mission, saw, and that's perhaps because they knew not to drink from these stagnant waterholes. I'm just starting in my research to examine some of the adaptations to these effects of extreme weather. In the interwar period, drugs were fairly limited and were often quite crude. So in the wake of public health and hygiene movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, the Australian Inland Mission nurses placed a great emphasis on prevention through hygiene, sanitation education, and structural and behavioural change to housing and environments. The ability to adapt for these people was, of course, related to income, ownership of land, and security of employment. And I'll just talk briefly about a couple of these adaptations to the buildings. In the Diamantina Channel Country, many stations had outbuildings made of cane grass, and I'll just show you a couple of photographs related to this. Slideshow in the beginning. Okay. So this is a cane grass church in Thargomindah. Unfortunately, it was actually eaten by goats in a drought, but you can see that's the type of construction they had on the Diamantina River at the time. These cane grass buildings were much cooler than corrugated iron and cooled down much more quickly at night. Some stations also had bore water which soaked canvas or hessian enclosures to create improvised evaporative cooling, or had raised sleeping platforms such as this one. You can see that's surrounded by hessian, which people could sleep on to catch the breeze. And I'll just talk a bit about Alice Springs and Inaminka hospitals. These were designed specifically for climate conditions. The Alice Springs, this is the Inaminka hospital. I haven't actually got a photograph at the moment of the Alice Springs hospital. The Alice Springs hospital was constructed with the advice from the resident AIM nurse, Jean Finlayson. It included passive air conditioning system of ventilation, which drew air through a cellar over wet hessian bags with air ducts in all rooms. The system filtered dust, and the building had the ability to be thoroughly sealed during sandstorms. There was a central hall with raised lantern ceiling with hot vented air, and you can see Inaminka had the same. Thick stone walls, overhanging verandas, wide enough to wheel beds on hot nights. So just finally, how can all of this be relevant today? I think that exploring past events, knowing people have been through these events before, learned and adapted, can become part of our identity, as Deb Anderson's talked about in her book. And personal experiences can demystify and reveal counter-narratives, as Margaret Cook talked about last week in her talk. And specifically, while we have to be cautious about translating directly from past to present, I think practical adaptations from the past can reveal alternative possibilities and be reinvigorated and repurposed. And I see some parallels today with the pandemic response. In the absence of a silver bullet vaccine and with limited treatments, we're relying on hygiene, social distancing and masks, those kind of behavioural public health responses. So public health and prevention have again come to the fore, and different vulnerabilities are again being revealed in this kind of pandemic. Similarly, I think faced with the daunting challenge of extreme weather, I think behavioural, structural changes to architecture and public health will all again have to play a vital role. Thank you.